when we're live. Hi, Zoomers. I'm just waiting a moment while we get live on YouTube. Look like that's happened. Hello, everybody. As I think most of you know, on Wednesday afternoon, the Biden administration, having faced pressures from groups who fancy themselves to be humanitarian, backed a plan to waive patent protection on COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutics for the duration of the pandemic. This is a conversation about why that policy is wrong, why it's immoral, impractical, and destructive. I'm Greg Salmieri. I'm a senior scholar of philosophy at the Salem Center for Policy at the University of Texas, Austin. The center is hosting this event. I'm joined today by Adam Mossoff and Amish Adalja. Adam is a professor at the Scalia Law School at George Mason University and co-founder of the Center for Protection of Intellectual Property. He's one of, perhaps the leading defender of intellectual property rights in the world today. Amish is senior scholar at the Johns Hopkins Center for Biosecurity. He's an expert on emerging infectious diseases and pandemic preparedness. If you've been following the news media at all over the last year, you'll recognize him from his many appearances on all the major media outlets explaining different aspects, medical aspects and policy aspects of the pandemic, and appreciate him as a voice of clarity and reason in a too fraught situation. I should mention I'm pleased to count both of them as old friends. And I should also mention that the opinions we each express here are our own and not necessarily shared by other members of the institutions for which we work. As the title and my intro makes clear, this is an advocacy panel. We have a point of view here. This is wrong, and we're going to tell you why we think it's wrong. But I'd like us to start by just reviewing some of the basic facts of the situation. And I want to start then by kicking it to Adam. Can you tell us just what is this policy change that's now being advocated, and where is it in the process of going from a proposal to a policy?
Oh, excellent. Great question, because I think there's a lot of also just kind of basic factual misunderstandings about what the announcement by U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai was this past Wednesday. So this is all occurring at the World Trade Organization, which is the body that governs the various international treaties that United States and other countries have entered into. And in this particular context, the treaty is known as TRIPS. It's just the acronym for Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Protection. And TRIPS essentially harmonizes intellectual property protections, offers various trade benefits to countries if they adopt internally intellectual property protections, and also provides mechanisms for countries to bring complaints before the World Trade Organization with penalties like trade sanctions for countries that violate other countries' citizens' intellectual property rights. And so TRIPS has been responsible for many countries, especially in the developing world, adopting intellectual property protections, because that was a requirement of this agreement. And the proposal, which was made to the World Trade Organization last September by India and South Africa, was for a complete waiver under TRIPS of all intellectual property in any COVID-19 related vaccine or drug. And by the way, it primarily has been about patents, but it's all intellectual property rights. So it's trade secrets, trademarks, even copyrights. Traditionally, these waivers have been submitted to the WTO for many decades, and the United States and the other countries in the G7 have opposed them, understandably so. And for the very first time, an unprecedented move this past Wednesday, Catherine Tai, the U.S. Trade Representative of the United States, announced that the Biden administration would support the proposal for a waiver. It's just a proposal at this point, so there has to actually be language, and then the WTO functions as on a consensus basis, so other countries have to support it. But now that the U.S. is folded, it's widely expected that even Germany and Switzerland and other countries that have come out against it will eventually fold as well, and that by the late fall, the WTO will probably adopt the waiver.
Thanks, Adam. And Amish, can you tell us a bit about where we are in the pandemic now, particularly in developing countries, particularly in India, and where we are in the pandemic and where we are particularly in vaccine rollout relates to the reasons given to support this policy?
So when it comes to the pandemic, we have a very different timescale for the world. We have countries like the United States, Israel, UK, who have largely contained this virus in terms of its ability to cause serious disease, hospitalization, death, or to threaten hospital capacity. And that's due almost entirely to the success of the vaccines that have been rolled out. In many parts of the developing world, however, they have very poor access to vaccines, meaning that their countries in the United States, for example, we had advanced purchase agreements with companies to secure vaccines for the population of the country. That didn't necessarily happen or couldn't happen in many other countries because they're resource limited. There are certain organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, like the World Health Organization's COVAX program that are getting vaccines into those countries. So all of those countries have some mechanism, but it is true that the majority of vaccines have been given to the most high-income countries in the world. And we know how beneficial these vaccines are. And what's happened in India is they've had an explosion, not so much from an access of vaccines problem, but because of, I think, poor policy at the Indian government level. So just to give you a quick nutshell, what happened there. They were largely spared the severe consequences of the first wave. They had a major lockdown, but in a country like India, where people live on $1 and $2 a day, you can't do that forever. You can't do that anywhere forever, but there it was very acute and people migrated away from cities, the biggest migration that India had ever seen in recent decades. Then they thought they had defeated it. The prime minister there said, we had defeated COVID-19. We're going to make vaccines for the world, because India is a net vaccine exporter. They have a big pharmaceutical industry. They're actually a maker of the AstraZeneca vaccine and also another vaccine that they've made of their own. And what happened was people got complacent. They didn't, the vaccine uptake was very low, maybe 1% or so. And what you saw then was massive export of vaccines, because India was thought to be one of the countries that's going to vaccinate the world. There was a big agreement called the Quad Agreement that India was part of that was going to use Indian vaccines to vaccinate the developing world. And at the same time, this outbreak took off in India, and they likely developed a more contagious variant, the 617 variant, and they have a very fragile health system where they cannot deal with a major surge or prolonged surge. So they're in dire straits. They don't have enough vaccine now. Now there've been export restrictions slapped on those vaccines that were designated for the COVAX program, and it's really a major mess. And the same type of thing is happening in other countries. India is particularly notable because it was a vaccine exporter and was part of the global response to COVID-19. That's why there's so much alarm. But the same is true in terms of not having the population vaccinated in many other countries around the world. And that's why people are trying to figure out what's the best solution to get the population of the world vaccinated to control this pandemic, because we know if it burns out of control in one country, all countries are going to have some risk and the world is going to remain disrupted.
Thanks. Why could each of you explain your take on what the reasoning is behind the lifting of the patent protections, why it's thought that this is necessary now, that it's good, that it's proper, and why you disagree with that? And I'll say a bit about my perspective on that after. Do you want to start? Why don't we start with Amish, because you're can start with the health policy aspect of it, and Adam then move to the more IP side of it.
So what I would say is that I work in infectious diseases, and I work at a think tank where we're constantly trying to engage stakeholders to try and be interested in this topic and also concretize what the threat of infectious disease is. And when you look at infectious diseases versus other branches of medicine, it's a place where we've really languished. We don't have those advances that we have in cancer. Many companies, for example, when it comes to vaccines or antivirals or antibiotics, have pulled out because it's not very lucrative. It's not something that has a great risk-return ratio compared to making a drug for cholesterol. And one of the things that I've worked on a lot is trying to encourage companies to engage here. And one of the ways to do that is by showing them what the danger of a pandemic is, and then also trying to encourage them to make products. And one of the things that I would say is that when these companies are investing in an uncertain type of thing, like emerging infectious diseases, where they don't know what the market size is, they don't know who's going to buy this, they don't know if this outbreak is going to occur, they don't know how long it will occur, and those are the things that when they go to their board of directors are going to tell them, don't invest in this type of thing. So what I would always, what what intellectual property does, what those patents do, especially with technologies that have broad-based uses like mRNA vaccines or vaccine platform technologies or monoclonal antibodies or specific diagnostic tests, is that they have the ability to de-risk that. And one of the things that these companies need, and I think it was what premises them even engaging in such a field, is the fact that they're going to have something to fall back on, that they're going to have a patent, that they're going to have some predictability to offset those risks that they're taking. And I think that's one of the major worries I have, is that we have a hard enough time getting infectious disease products and getting companies engaged in infectious disease. We have shortages of tetanus vaccines and flu vaccines. And it's because companies don't want to engage in this field, because it is so different than other parts of medicine. And what I fear will happen is one of the last pieces, their intellectual property is one thing keeping them engaged. And I think this is going to be harder the next time we have an infectious disease emergency, just to get them even at the table, if this is the result that they get.
Let me break in here and say, when you tweeted about this, in terms of incentives and engagement, and why will companies produce if they don't have the patent which enables them to make money on what they've produced? Why would a creator do this? I see people tweeting back with nasty things like, maybe because they care about people, maybe because they love humanity, maybe because they're interested in researching things. And that just seems to me to, in a way, be besides the point. No matter how much you're interested in doing something, no matter how much you think it will be good for the world, no matter how much you are motivated by the passion of solving this intellectual problem, if every time you do it, it's made to be a sacrifice, you're made to suffer for it, you're not able to recoup the investment of your time and money and energy in doing it. Maybe you could afford to do it as a hobby or a charity on the sideline, but you're not going to be able to afford to be able to do it much. And again, if you're trying to attract investors, if you're trying to attract people to work for you, maybe some of them will do it as a charity and maybe it's good, but you can't afford to have the world can't afford, and nobody can afford to have a major section of productive life handled as a kind of charitable endeavor where the people who do it don't get to capture any of the value that they create, or get to capture very little of it. And I see that as kind of important to understanding what property rights in general are and what intellectual property rights in particular are. And so, Adam, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this issue, and particularly its application to vaccine and therapeutic patents in a time of crisis like this.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. And you raise a really great point. It's a point that I constantly make when I'm talking about intellectual property and the role that it serves, because most people think of intellectual property as merely an incentive to invent. But that's not what intellectual property does, although it certainly serves that function, like all property rights do. If you tell a farmer they can keep the fruits of their labors, the farmer will farm. But that we can incentivize invention through all sorts of ways, as people constantly respond to both Amish and me, with prizes, and tax incentives, or just the feelings of the good of the world and things of this sort. But it is universally recognized by economists and even historians that the success of the US patent system in particular, which became the model for all patent systems around the world, which was a novel patent system starting in 1790, was that we took a property rights approach to it. And by what I mean by that is that it wasn't simply just this monopoly grant that was conferred upon a person. It was something you could go into the market with and trade and commercialize, use as collateral, use as the foundation for entering into agreements and other licensing deals and other types of exchanges to create value. In other words, property rights, in particular intellectual property rights, serve this bridge from the kind of the lab or the garage where you have the idea and the ultimate innovation of the product that is bought and sold by producers and consumers in the marketplace. And that's what property rights do in all contexts, whether it's for the farmer or whether it's for the innovators at Pfizer. And this is exactly why the US led the world in biotech innovation, is because we took the lead actually in 1980 with a very famous US Supreme Court decision and said, biotech innovations are protectable and secured under our U.S. patent system. And as a result of that, venture capital financing and investments immediately in the billions started to flow into the research and development. And then on the basis of these reliable and effective property rights, the people were able to make these investments and then turn around and enter into all of the important necessary licensing and other commercial agreements all along the value chain to convert these inventions in labs and in universities into actual products. And this is why the biopharmaceutical industry had such an incredible, unprecedented response to this pandemic. Previously, it was, I think the average is about 4 years for a vaccine to be developed. As is well known, Moderna created its vaccine in about 2 days, and BioNTech, which was in an agreement with Pfizer, created its mRNA vaccine in 2 hours, and it was able to do that on the basis of this foundation of not just technical know-how that had been developed through investments secured through the patent system, but through a massive infrastructure of agreements, already information sharing agreements, commercial relationships, licensing deals, and all of the other types of complex commercial exchanges one expects to see in a free market that follows from property rights, that makes possible just the cornucopia of goods and services that you expect to see anywhere in the marketplace.
So I hear a lot of the credit for the vaccine development and the fast timeline being given to Project Warp Speed, which was a particular initiative of the U.S. government, and claims made that as a result of that, the U.S. government should have more of a say over whether these patents get protected. What was Warp Speed? This is a question for both of you. And what was its role? How did it fit with the other kinds of factors that you mentioned, Adam, in making it possible for vaccines to become available so quickly?
So I'll take a little bit of this first. So Operation Warp Speed was a program from the Trump administration to basically incentivize and encourage the development of vaccines for COVID-19. And one of the main features of this was advanced purchase agreements, because as I said earlier, when you're going into an emerging infectious disease outbreak, you have no idea what the size is going to be, who's going to buy it. And if you've got an advanced purchase agreement, and basically what the government did is said, we're going to buy all the vaccines. You can't sell it to anybody else. There's an export restriction. We're using the Defense Production Act, but that's all part of it. But really what it was saying, you've got a guaranteed market for these vaccines. We're going to buy them. We know that you've got this technologies. There was many companies that sort of auditioned for Operation Warp Speed, a portfolio approach, and they picked 1 or 2 from each different type of technology category. So Pfizer and Moderna for mRNA, AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson for adenovirus vectored, Novavax for another type. So there was a whole kind of audition process, just knowing that they were going to need vaccines. And that's what they did. And it's important to know that these companies, and they all had different types of different agreements. So for example, Pfizer wasn't part of the original Operation Warp Speed money. They took money at the second part of that for distribution and buying of doses, was that there was a guarantee that their intellectual property was going to be sacrosanct, that it wasn't going to be something that would be given away. I do give Operation Warp Speed credit, because it was able to pull these vaccines through, but they didn't actually invest in the technology or the invention of these vaccines. And from my understanding, what it was really was support for manufacturing, logistics, and advanced purchase agreements. That's really where it really had its major benefit in pulling this through. And I think I give credit to Operation Warp Speed because it worked. And I think many other countries didn't have that type of program, and that's why we have more than enough vaccines to vaccinate. But I don't think that was a trade-off for giving away the intellectual property, especially after the fact. And companies like Moderna haven't even been enforcing their patent throughout this, even though they were part of Operation Warp Speed. But I'll let Adam.
Amish said very well, though I would be a little bit more precise. He said it was to incentivize the development. The vaccines were developed, as you emphasized at the very end, and I think we should be really clear about this, because these are the claims that people are cashing in on when they say, oh, the government actually helped produce these vaccines. No, they didn't. There was zero government involvement in the actual creation of the vaccines. Operation Warp Speed was the government's promise, as Amish described, to companies like Moderna and Pfizer, that we will buy the vaccine once it's FDA approved. And the promise of that buying it is what allowed those companies then to say, all right, we'll invest in manufacturing capacity. Because it's a huge process, and it's very expensive as well to create your manufacturing facilities and all of the distribution mechanisms along the value chain to get these to patients. And so, and that was the role of Operation Warp Speed. it was not an investment in the actual research and development of the vaccine itself. As I mentioned, those vaccines were created and were handed over to the FDA to begin testing in February of 2020. And in fact, the year that it took for them to reach patients was not due to the development process of the vaccines themselves. It was due to the testing by the FDA and the time it took to create the manufacturing and distribution facilities and mechanisms to get them to patients.
I should mention that we have people who are watching within Zoom. The Q&A module is on, so if anybody wants to ask a question, please, put it in the Q&A, and we'll get to it. Also, I'm monitoring Facebook. If anyone's watching us there and wants to write a question, just write it in a comment, and we will. I see one or two people have, and we'll come to them in due course. I want to ask you a premise behind the idea that in order to help India, in order to help other countries and the people in these countries who are suffering the brunt of this pandemic now and who don't have access to vaccines, the idea is that we need to lift these patent protections to get them vaccinated more quickly. What role do the patents play here? Is it the case, or is there and what are the arguments that the existence of this IP is the bottleneck? Is this what's holding up getting more shots in the arms of people in Bangalore or wherever, in any region we might be thinking about?
I would say no.
So I wrote an op-ed on this a couple of weeks ago about the actual waiver proposal, and I've been writing op-eds on this for the past year about the pandemic generally, because this is not the first time that people have been proposing that the government confiscate or take over and impose price controls on drugs and vaccines related to COVID-19 treatments, and it's just the first time that the U.S. government has actually endorsed it. And the answer is that there is zero evidence that patents have been a bottleneck or have prevented the actual distribution and use of any drugs or vaccines related to COVID-19. Zero. And this is confirmed by the governments themselves. So the federal government's General Accountability Office did a report on vaccine development and distribution back in February, and it found that the various things that had delayed vaccine distribution to patients were manufacturing delays and trying to get manufacturing facilities up and running, lack of skilled workers, so lack of know-how, and some general commercial difficulties. Patents are not mentioned once. This is, like all property rights, patents are the easy go-to whipping boy every time that there's a problem to say, oh yeah, it must be patents. Patents are the blockade. Patents are the problem. And as I mentioned, there's not only zero evidence of saying this, people were saying this even before there were actual vaccines and drugs. So people were proposing price controls in the United States on any vaccines or drugs back in February, March, and April of 2020. And so this is just another example where good people and good and the individual rights that make possible these types of incredible cures and incredible ability to have flourishing lives are held out in improper ways as the sources of problems, as opposed to being the actual facilitator of solutions and the causes of the solutions themselves.
Yeah, I agree 100%. This is a manufacturing supply chain issue, and there are still export restrictions that are in place in many parts of the world to prevent companies from exporting vaccines. That's the real issue. And as I said earlier, Moderna's vaccine, the patent is not being enforced. Nobody is making Moderna except for Moderna. This is something that's more complex than patents. And as Adam said, this is a long process, this waiver. This isn't going to help the people of India now. This isn't probably going to even come to fruition. By the time it actually winds its way through in Congress and all of that, there's going to be supply for vaccine in India, and it may even be domestically produced because they have their own vaccine. So I think this is kind of, to me, a smokescreen for what they're really after, which is the whole basis for biopharmaceutical innovation.
Yeah, I mean, the patents are just being totally attacked here improperly. Just to reinforce what Amish just said, I was talking with a representative from the pharmaceutical industry yesterday. They said that their projections are that there will be 20 billion doses of vaccines available by the end of 2021. And I mean, so that, I mean, there's only what 8.5 billion people on the entire planet. I mean, this is just not something. This waiver is not only unnecessary, it's destructive and wrong.
So can you say a little bit more, Imish, about the situation with Moderna? You're saying their patent's not being enforced. That's not just they haven't sued anyone yet for violating it. I take it the idea is they've said other people can manufacture this if they want to. And then in that case, what is the bottleneck? Why isn't, and this is a ridiculous way to put it, but why isn't everybody in India and in Brazil, mixing up the Moderna vaccine in their bathtub and handing it out to their friends? I mean, what is involved in creating this, and why is Moderna in a better position to do it, not just than random people, but then, whatever companies there are in India that are manufacturing other vaccines? And I mean, this is a sophisticated country with a medical infrastructure. Why can't they just whip it out?
It's hard. That's the point. mRNA vaccines are a specific type of vaccine technology that requires specific manufacturing standards. And you have to remember that even if then the Indian regulatory body has to decide that this manufacturing plant is safe, it's effective, this vaccine is that's a hard thing to do, especially since India is making the AstraZeneca vaccine, and they have their own inactivated vaccine that they're making. But it may be that those two vaccines are most suitable for India, but it's not an easy thing to do, to just do that. You need a lot of technology. You need to have expertise at working with the mRNA platform. And Moderna is, their whole founding is based on mRNA vaccine technology. Their actual stock ticker symbol is mRNA. So they've been working on mRNA vaccines for cancer, for lots of things. I did projects with them well before the pandemic because and if you're interested, I wrote a report on vaccine platform technologies pre-pandemic, which talks about the promise of mRNA vaccines for emerging infectious disease. So this is something that they have honed, and they're going to be able to be the best at making it. And if you're a regulatory agency in some other country, you want to make sure that even if your country's got the recipe, that they're actually churning out something that's actually what it is, that it's safe and effective, and have quality control and what are called good manufacturing process, GMP, all of that. That's not something you can do overnight, especially with a vaccine that has a novel technology, has a lipid nanoparticle that's needed. This is something that's really hard to do. Both the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are unique in that perspective. So I think that's not surprising to me that nobody's making the Moderna vaccine, even though Moderna has said during the pandemic anybody can make it.
Adam, you've said a bit about this before, but can you say a little bit more about the role of intellectual property in the process by which the infrastructure to build these things is created? I mean, why can't it just be Moderna announces, here's the formula for the vaccine, and then everybody just at that point starts tooling up factories to make it? Why is a property right part of the process by which it's possible to get this vaccine into people?
Yeah, it's a great question. And what Amish said is exactly right, which is why, by the way, the waiver is broader than just patents, because they recognize it. And they've said this explicitly, that it's what they refer to as know-how and tech transfer. And they are explicitly saying, now that the proposal has been approved by the US, oh yes, and by the way, this is going to require forced tech transfer. So we're going to have to compel the disclosure of what are now protected as trade secrets and other types of technical knowledge by companies like Moderna and Pfizer to companies, well, anyone in the world asking for it, potentially, in India, China, Brazil, and elsewhere. And so this development of know-how is really important and is a key part of the development side of research and development that goes into actually converting a drug or even a vaccine into a viable therapeutic treatment that can be used by patients in the healthcare market. And it's not unique to in the biopharmaceutical industry. Patents serve the same function, and property rights serve the same function in the high-tech industry and in every other area of the free market, where property rights provide the foundation by which people can then agree with each other. What are the terms under which you will use my information and knowledge? And what are the terms in which I will use your information and knowledge? And here's what we will pay each other. And here's the agreement that we will sign that will be enforceable in court, and that we can understand. We have an objective foundation for our interactions peacefully for a value creating commercial interaction. And this is what is facilitated and made possible by property rights. And this is why I often refer to patents as launching pads, as platforms for innovation. And is because this is what it makes possible. And as I mentioned, this is what the United States innovated itself by saying patents should be property rights. They shouldn't be these monopoly grants that are just personal grants to a particular individual, which is what they originally were in England. And so, for instance, Watt, when he made his inventive contributions to the steam engine, he couldn't go out and just sell and transfer his grant from the crown to others. He had to do it himself along with other people like Matthew Bolton. This was distinguished from US innovators now in the biotech space and the high tech space who say, well, I can invent this, but I also want to work with you to help manufacture. We can create a disaggregated, distributed supply chain and a manufacturing chain, what I like to call the value chain, that where we can take advantage of our respective expertise and specialties and investments, and we can work together to develop and create a product more efficiently. This is exactly what Adam Smith identified as the key role of property rights in the Wealth of Nations in 1776, facilitating specialization and division of labor, which is what maximizes value creation in the marketplace.
I want to turn to the questions we're getting from both Zoom and YouTube, but let me ask first, Amos, you kind of touched on this before. Are there any policies that are in place now that you think are slowing access to vaccines around the world, slowing the ability to produce them? If the administration or the WTO were taking your advice on this and we're really concerned about what can we do to speed up above the already seemingly surprisingly fast pace or shockingly fast pace at which vaccines are being produced and made available, what would the main steps be? You mentioned export restrictions. Could you say a bit more about that? And are there any others?
So it primarily is export restrictions because you've got countries that are not allowing vaccine to be exported outside of the country. We knew that was going to happen. It happened during the H1N1 pandemic when Australia had export restrictions on when they developed the H1N1 vaccine first. Those still exist. There has been some softening by the Biden administration on certain export restrictions, but it's not just the vaccines. It's even the materials needed to make the vaccines that there have been export restrictions. And these restrictions also exist in other countries, not just the United States. They exist in the EU. The EU and England have had a big fight over export restrictions regarding the AstraZeneca vaccine. That's one major part. Now, India also has had import restrictions. So India had a restriction where you couldn't they wanted all of the ingredients to be homegrown for the vaccine, which made it harder for them to even get the vaccine ingredients that were needed from other countries. All of that has to go. There's a lot of mercantilism going on, I would say, and that's what's causing this type of problem. And I think that's what needs to be the focus. If our goal is to stop this pandemic now, quickly, to save lives tomorrow, it's getting rid of those access barriers, not this IP issue. That's not going to, as I said earlier, have any immediate impact, if any, ever.
All right, let me start with some of the questions that are coming in. Steve on YouTube asked something we somewhat addressed before. I don't know, Steve, if you wrote this before or after we started talking about it, but I think there's more to say about it. So let me just read his question. What about all the public money used to help develop the COVID vaccines? Why do the pharma companies get the free money and get to keep the patents? Adam, both of you said a bit on this, but is there anything more to say on it?
Yes, this is a common argument that one hears even before the COVID-19 pandemic. This has been a basis for people pushing for price controls and government takeover of patented drugs for many, many years now. Well, we all know the government funds and everyone creating these drugs, and therefore, since the government paid for it, people should get it for free since the taxpayers are already paying for it. A couple points to make about this. First of all, it's actually not true that the government is the primary funder of all medical research. The NIH, which is the largest single funding institution in the world, provides about 31 billion each year in funding to medical research. That's compared to the last numbers we have from 2019 of private industry, private sector R&D investments in the biopharmaceutical sector was 139 billion. So you have a factor of almost 4 to 1, more than 4 to 1 of private to public funding. Also, most of that funding by NIH is very, very far upstream research funding, and it is so, and it's in a lot of kind of early initial research that doesn't actually lead to an actual development of a therapeutic treatment that is then patented and sold in the marketplace. And so just because you can say 31 billion doesn't mean that 31 billion is actually going to actual development of research and development of actual drugs. For instance, this came up in the remdesivir debate, because as everyone knows, remdesivir is the first drug that was actually approved by the FDA for treatment of severe respiratory ailments caused by COVID. And there was immediate calls for the government to march in and impose compulsory licensing and price controls on it, because the claim was the government helped produce this. The government did not help create remdesivir at all. It was originally developed at Gilead to treat Ebola and some other conditions. It would prove to be not successful, so it was put on the shelf, which is what happens very often. For those who don't know, for every drug that's sold in the marketplace, that represents on average 10,000 molecules that were originally researched by a biopharmaceutical company that proves unsuccessful. And so, and now the government did provide some through the Army some funding for some testing of it in the Ebola context after the drug had been developed, but they hadn't provided any money for it actually in the creation of the drug itself. And that is the key. I mean, and so when everyone keeps saying, "Oh, government always pays for this," it's just not true. So now but that leads to the second point. The government does pay for some, and this is part and parcel of the problem with public funding, government funding, I should say, not public funding, taxpayer government funding of anything, is that it provides this basis then to justify growth of more status controls and more state and more takeovers of private enterprise, because the argument is, hey, the government provided the access to X, therefore the taxpayers have a claim to this. We heard Obama invoke this, right? When he said, "You didn't build this," right? And remember what he was talking about. He was talking about the roads and the public education system and all the things that the government invests in. And so you're seeing the exact same arguments being deployed now in the biopharmaceutical context through what is, relatively small funding overall by NIH.
There's also, I would think, a tremendous lack of appreciation of what the achievement of making a product available is. Mm-hmm. It's not just, someone has an idea or finds a molecule or even tests the molecule and proves that it's effective. You have to build the product. You have to produce it. You have to distribute it. You have to figure out how to do that. All of that takes long-term investment, strategizing before the pandemic about what kind of factories you're going to have, how much cash you're going to have in reserve, all kinds of arrangements to make it possible to produce when the need comes, to make it possible to get things somewhere. That is all an achievement, and that is the achievement that is done. It's the achievement of the entrepreneurs involved. Their business is a productive activity. It's not just some fat cat shuffling papers while someone else produces everything, right? There's the production of creating the infrastructure, creating the supply chain, solving all the employment management problems. All of that has to be done by someone, and that's a major part of making drugs or any other product available. That's what's made possible to do by a patent system. And the alternative to that is it not being possible for anybody to capture the value they create by doing that. Instead, you have some kind of commissar doing it, which leads to shortages of needed things and overabundance of, size 6 shoes that no one wears or something. That's the kind of Soviet system of production. It doesn't work. It doesn't work because it's wrong. And because it's wrong, it leads to disasters in practice. And the alternative to that is recognizing people's rights to what they produce and the ability to trade in the use of those products and trade on the rights to them, which is what intellectual property is.
Yes, I don't want to. I don't know if Amish had any more to say about the matter from a public health perspective. I know that he speaks on this a lot. as well.
I would just add one point that I sometimes notice that people think that these vaccines are just magically here, that they grew on some tree in the Garden of Eden, and that they are just there. They don't understand how long it's take, how much investment companies like Moderna, BioNTech, all of them to make this technology. Johnson & Johnson's technology derives from the Ebola vaccine back several years ago. So this is something that I think people forget. They just think that these are there and they're there for the taking, and not and don't realize that they wouldn't be there if people actually didn't exert the productive effort. You know, I keep all 3 vials of them here. It's like my little props because they're so valuable. I think I have empty vials just to remind myself that these didn't exist. And I think that people just think that these came out of the air. They did not.
Yeah, and it's not, I mean, people think the incentive to create these things is the benefit they'll give to the world, or the intellectual problem solving, or loving the people that you're going to help by them. And all of that's true in the motivation of anybody who creates anything.
Yeah.
But it's not like, oh, they just do it for the paycheck. But if when they do those things, their time, their effort, their investment isn't compensated, they're expropriated for doing it. If the risks they take are such that they bear all the downsides and none of the upsides of those risks, nobody could afford to do it, and certainly not at scale. And so what we're talking about doing is taking the benefactors of humanity and cutting off their limbs, in effect, sacrificing them for the benefit that they've given to us. But this brings me to some of the questions that we're getting. Both Seth on Zoom, and then a different way, Ian on Facebook, ask, well, I'll put it the way Seth did. What is underneath this policy? Ian says most of the experts have admitted that there won't be a short-term benefit from this anyway. If that's right, as Seth puts it, it's a kind of smokescreen. So what's motivating this? What's motivating this policy? What's motivating the government to do it? What's motivating various humanitarian groups to advocate for it? What are they seeking?
I'll just add one aspect of this from my field, is that there are many advocates that see a disproportionate number of infectious diseases in certain countries, and they think that this is a way, and the same is true for insulin or for any other drug, that they think that this is a barrier to equal or complete access for all of these medications. And I think their whole goal is to basically dismantle this whole intellectual property apparatus and have everything just be there. And again, it goes back to what I just said. They just assume that these things are going to continue to be created at the same rate if there's no reward for the people doing it, or if there's no actual mechanism for them to create or have these platforms or launch pads, as Adam said, for this. That's what I think is here. That they have just this disdain for this whole idea. They don't like pharmaceutical companies. They've not liked them for. They think that this. I think it's all tied up into that type of psychology and that type of cultural milieu. And this is just, I think, a kind of a shot across the bow of what they are capable of doing and what they want to do in the future. And I think we will all suffer if they are successful, if it's not exposed for what it is, because this isn't about COVID-19. This is a larger problem that we're dealing with. And I really worry about what's going to happen when we don't have these products available, when companies disengage because of this. I think Adam probably has more to say too on this.
Yeah. Amish really hit the nail on the head very well. And I'll just add, right, that, Rahm Emanuel, the President Obama's chief of staff infamously said, right, you never let a good crisis go to waste. It allows you to get away with things that you could not get away with before. It's not a coincidence that the people who propose this IP waiver, and the people who are supporting it, and have been lauding it since it was embraced by the United States, have always been opposed to patents and have always been opposed to intellectual property. This isn't like all of a sudden they woke up and said, oh my God, people are dying by COVID, so I have to rethink my whole belief in the patent system or the IP system. These people have been consistent about their opposition to the free market, to property rights, to intellectual property, for precisely the reasons that Amish mentioned, and Greg, I believe you mentioned earlier as well, is that they take for granted and assume that people will produce, that goods just are manna from heaven. They deny the role of the individual rational mind in having to create these types of products and invest the resources and invest the time to not just create them, but then to produce them and manufacture them and work with others to do so. and they embrace this moral ideal that another person's need or demand, whether it's an explosion of cases in the developing world, or whether it's a sick person in West Virginia or in Nevada, is a legitimate moral claim to a producer or creator's fruits of their labors. And so I think all of this goes together to form a perfect storm. And when you have an emergency, whether it's COVID or whether it was AIDS, because were trying to do the exact same thing in the AIDS epidemic in the 80s and 90s. People, all of those premises get activated, and they can take advantage of the fact that people are freaked out and are in emergency mode to get away with it then.
So one way to put it is that there's ideological opposition to IP and to capitalism generally. And that ideological opposition mobilizes in times of crisis. But I don't think we should put that point as there are people who are motivated by ideology rather than facts, and this is bad, because that makes ideology, seem like a bad term. You need ideas. You need an abstract framework. You need an understanding of the world. You need an understanding of principle to make sense of any crisis, to make sense of what responses will and won't work, to understand why they do, to understand the facts. And if you have the wrong ideological framework, you will understand and respond to the facts wrongly. And if you have the right one, you'll respond rightly. How do you know which one is right? Well, that's a large subject in political philosophy, and we can think about that. But one part of it is you have to look at what kind of analyses does it let you do to the facts in particular situations. Do they make sense? Or are what you getting distortions? And so I hope people who are listening to this are hearing the way we're thinking about this from a perspective that values individual rights, that values the mind, that understands the mind as a property of individual human beings, that is the source of value and wealth and life, and that rights are needed to protect them. Understand how we're understanding the facts on the ground in light of this and interpreting the events, and look at the arguments that other people are making, and see how they're processing the data, given their different views of how they're coming at it, and which makes more sense. Which makes more sense of the facts of history, the facts of the present. Let me ask a question that came from Philip online. Some have suggested that the negotiations are a tactic to get the companies to lower licensing costs. Have companies been holding out trying to make extraordinary profits? And has damage already been done to the innovation ecosystem by putting IP up for negotiation at the WTO? So this question I throw out to both of you.
I'll answer the second part of that. And I think that as someone who tries to, as I said earlier, engage companies in infectious disease innovation and tries to figure out ways to get new products for neglected tropical diseases or pandemic threats, I think that this is definitely going to damage because now it shows that what was kind of one of the cornerstones of what was enticing companies to be involved in this or would give them some assurance is something that's up for negotiation. It's not something that they can rely on. And I think that's going to already poison the whole atmosphere. I'm involved in projects right now to think about the next pandemic and think about different medical countermeasure development programs that people can engage in. And I think that's going to be much harder to get companies at the table because of what happened. And this similarly with Zika. So we don't have a vaccine for Zika. And the Zika outbreak occurred. Sanofi Pasteur had a great Zika vaccine, great data that was published in major peer-reviewed journals. And they had an exclusive agreement with the US military because the military is everywhere. They need to protect their soldiers with Zika. And what happened was Senator Sanders wrote an op-ed in the New York Times saying, this is a horrible deal. This is and Sanofi basically threw their hands up and said, we're done. We don't want to engage in this because we did this and it's not even a really lucrative product. And look what happened, all the bad press. This is that times 100. So I think that there is going to be something we all pay for this.
Adam, you talked when we were chatting before a bit about past instances of this kind of phenomenon. You mentioned one involving Brazil, cases where intellectual right or property rights were violated in cases of medical disaster, what happened as a result of it. Could you say a bit about the kind of history of this kind of a move?
Yes, so it's very common that when there are medical emergencies, and which is just a fact of life, that we will never escape, that there are people in governments who claim that this is the basis by which we need to set aside whatever rights that exist, and take what we quote need unquote, to address this emergency. And this happened with the AIDS epidemic, and that's when you first started to see these waiver proposals. First, there were just proposals for waivers. So what was just announced support from the U.S., which was, as I mentioned, unprecedented. The waivers never went through because they were never supported by the United States or the other countries in the G7, where there are biopharmaceutical companies. But what some companies did is they invoked under TRIPS a compulsory licensing provision, which allowed for, if there's a public health emergency, government can issue licenses without authorization from the patent owner to have the drug manufactured and sold and used in that particular country. And Brazil did that a couple decades ago with an AIDS drug that it claimed was needed to address an epidemic in its country. And what happened was that they invoked this compulsory licensing scheme against Merck, then they turned around and went to give compulsory licenses out to the companies in their country, and no one knew how to make the drug. They didn't have the technical know-how that Amish talked about earlier. They didn't have the trade secrets and the knowledge that was necessary to actually put these plants together. It's kind of like what we've seen historically when there's been socialist revolutions and the workers take over the plants, and then they don't know how to run all the machinery and manage the books and do all the complex things that need to be done to actually made the factory work. And so even though they initiated this compulsory licensing provision, they ended up not being able to use it in their own country, and they ended up having to buy the drugs from India, and they ended up paying more money for the drugs from India than they would have paid originally if they had gotten them, if they had just purchased them from Merck in the first place. And so some people have pointed this out as an explanation of a very odd phenomenon that just happened with this patent waiver petition before the World Trade Organization under COVID, which is that Brazil didn't support it. And a lot of people found that very odd because Brazil historically has been very supportive of all of the past waiver proposals and the pushes for compulsory licensing under TRIPS, and they didn't support it. And people point to this instance of what happened when it evoked compulsory licensing under TRIPS 20 years ago as that it had learned its lesson, and that it realized that this is not the way to go, that this actually is more destructive and ends up harming them more, as such maneuvers always do.
One other topic, I have two other topics I want to touch on. I think we can, could we go up to the next hour rather than the next half hour? Yeah. So one is just, what are your impressions of the state of the public debate about this? The sides people are taking, I know Bill Gates had come out against this kind of a waiver. Then today, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation seems to have reversed its position away from the position Gates took in public previously. What's the state of debate? What are the voices out there saying? How much of a minority are we on this, the three of us who are opposing this? Just sort of what's the cultural atmosphere around this issue?
I would say that I think we are in the minority. However, the pharmaceutical industry is definitely on the same side as we are, but they're often dismissed because of the pharmaceutical industry. I would say that many people in my field think similarly to me, maybe not exactly, but obviously to speak up in this type of atmosphere is going to bring a lot of hate mail and trolls out. And that's what's happened to me continually, where people are continually barraging me. Even as we're speaking now, I'm seeing notifications. So it's something that's very difficult to do, because the pharmaceutical industry is like, they're portrayed as a villain, and anybody that defends them is considered, a sociopath. That's literally what I've been called. So I think that there is a silent minority that's not speaking up, but I think it's really important that we do so. And I think it's a matter of justice for me.
People are the ratio of actual knowledge of the facts and of moral outrage is very, very high from the other side. And the responses from intellectual property owners associations and from the Association of American Intellectual Property Lawyers and Intellectual Property Owners Association, and from the pharmaceutical industry generally have been pretty good, although some of them have been also, unfortunately, they embrace the premises that have drove this waiver petition and said, yes, well, there is a problem, and we but this just isn't the way to go about addressing it. They really need to take, I think, a more strong moral stand that, look, we are the saviors. We are the people who have created, through our work and labor and productivity, the ability to stop this pandemic from continuing. This pandemic will not be a repeat of the 1918 and 17 Spanish flu pandemic, where approximately 50 million people died around the world at a time when the world population was 15% of what it is today. And that is only because of all of the incredible knowledge and work and productive effort and application of reason by the scientists and researchers and business persons in the biopharmaceutical industry. And they have the moral high ground, and they should claim it, and they should claim it strongly. And they while they've been opposed to the waiver, they oppose it largely on practical grounds and on this this is not an effective way to really address these problems and things of this sort. And those points should be made, but they should also be challenging the moral premise that this is actually morally right, that we should be trying to do everything possible to service other people's needs and other people's claims against us.
Adam, do you have any comments on Gates's role specifically here? He's someone whose career has been marked by a real appreciation, especially early on, of the value of intellectual property. And I think some sense of the moral value of it, if you think back to a document I know from you, his letter to the Homebrew Computer Club at the dawn of Microsoft. Have you followed his response to this episode and the state of his thinking?
I haven't followed it tremendously closely. Amish may know more on the vaccine issues and other public health considerations than I. I mean, he was very pro intellectual property and recognized the key role that intellectual property would serve in creating a high-tech industry that we now know today, and serving as a foundation for the licensing model that Microsoft adopted as its business model, radically and innovative at the time. And but then he was attacked under the antitrust laws in the 1990s for his success, and Microsoft continued to be very strong and pro IP, but there were cracks in the foundations, and the company since then has changed dramatically and is not as pro IP anymore as it used to be.
I was interested in seeing him come out as a defender of IP in the vaccine case, knowing his history with Microsoft, and I thought that was fitting, and I was happy to see that consistency in him, and so I was saddened by the foundation going in a different direction today. I don't know, Amish, if you followed what he said on this, or if you have any thoughts on it.
He hasn't. Earlier on in the pandemic, he's been a major defender of intellectual property rights, and he got some criticism for it recently. And I think a recent BBC interview where he reiterated that position. But the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has now said that they believe no barrier, they quote, no barrier should be in the way of the vaccine, and they support a quote unquote narrow waiver. So I'm not sure what that means. I know that that came from the Bill and Melinda Gates Twitter account, the foundation account, and Bill Gates himself retweeted that. So I suspect that's his position has changed now. I think it's sad. It's unfortunate because he was a real voice for good on this. And when it comes to public health and global health, he's taken this genius mind that created Microsoft and made all our lives better, and has applied that to solving some of the most difficult public health challenges. And I think in our field, having that kind of an icon, that type of mental prowess there, it has made it so much easier to tackle some of these problems, because he brings, I think, that same expertise, that same level of ability to that intelligence to these problems. And I think that it was great to see him on the right, on what I think is the right side of this for some time. Hopefully he's still going to, I think he'll still be a force for good in this field. And full disclosure, I have taken money from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation on a cholera project once. But
thanks. So I think we should start to wrap up and come to the last issue. And I just want to kind of sense from you guys on overall how this move fits into how America's responded to this pandemic. And I think maybe this is a question more for Amish than for Adam, but for both of you. I mean, my sense is that throughout this whole episode, we've abandoned a principled American individual rights-based, liberal in the Lockean sense, approach to policy, and have acted as an understudy for the Chinese authoritarians. And this begins with Trump's denial of the problem, trying to cover it up, suppressing voices of dissenting scientists within his administration, all copied out of the Chinese playbook, then dealing with it not by individual rights-based measures, but by lockdown-type measures, granted less draconian here than in other places, but nevertheless, lockdown-type measures instituted by the federal and state governments under the previous administration. And now under the Biden administration, we have a continuation of this aping of China by rejecting the principle of property rights, in particular intellectual property. And I just find it really sad and a specimen of America's lack of self-esteem and lack of confidence in the principles that have made it distinct, that have made it a great nation, that have made it able to produce these kinds of vaccines so quickly, that instead of looking for solutions that are grounded on these principles, and for example, the manner that Ankar Ghate described in his white paper on government's role in a pandemic, we have this kind of following of China and of other authoritarian regimes. That's how I see this falling into the wider narrative of the pandemic response. I'm interested in your guys' each opinions on this.
I think this is another failure of the government. And you look at this pandemic's trajectory, most of the mistakes have been government failures. And some of those government failures were to not do what was right, but to do what countries like China did, to take an authoritarian response. And it is true, from the very beginning, this pandemic has been something that was characterized by evasion at the highest levels of government, where you had partisanship injected into it from the very start, where the wrong decisions were made for the wrong reasons, and scientists were silenced by the government for speaking out. You had a complete politicization of the CDC, which is the premier public health agency in the world. The CDC was basically bound, gagged, and thrown in a trunk and unable to speak. And you had, for example, heroes at the CDC like Nancy Messonnier basically disappeared for several months until the Biden administration took over. You had just I think that it is very eerily reminiscent of what an authoritarian state does, and I think it's just an example of how much work there needs to be done to put the United States back on the right footing. And I think that this is just just another example of just not looking long term, not thinking about what's necessary to make a country resilient to a pandemic. And I think it's sad. And I think instead of emulating China, we should be emulating China's nemesis, Taiwan, which is the real star of this pandemic and continues to be so.
Adam, closing thoughts on this?
Yeah, I share your same assessment and Amish's assessment of what has happened. What we should have had was the federal government and state governments come out and say, look, in 1918, when we last had mass, quarantines and shutdowns, because we didn't have antibiotics yet or treatments for viruses. There wasn't a biopharmaceutical industry yet. I mean, penicillin was discovered about a decade later. And that's why we had to do those things. We don't have to do that anymore. We have a modern biopharmaceutical industry that, by the way, has already created 2 vaccines, and they should have allowed people to take the vaccines. They should have said, hey, it's your life. Do you want to try the vaccine? And they should have eliminated the certificates on need that were the regulatory restrictions on creating new hospitals. And they should have eliminated the regulatory restrictions on PPE. And they should have just said, we are going to use this crisis for a good reason, to get rid of regulations and controls. And they sort of said, and by the way, as we figure out what, through the science, and we discover what things are happening, if you are, you should, as an individual, decide whether you want to wear a mask and whether people around you want to wear a mask, and companies can make the individual decision as company policies as to whether they will require masks. But that is to be left to the individuals to decide, because the premise is that it's your life and it's your liberty and it's your property. And, as we see in places like Texas and in other places where they've lifted the mask restrictions and the mask requirements and all of these things, some people have continued to wear masks in closed areas and things of that sort, and others have not. And there hasn't been an explosion in cases. It's just, yes, unfortunately, the result was authoritarianism driven by a collectivist premise that we have to protect other people. In fact, if we remember that was the original justification for the masks. It's not for you, it's to help other people in case you're sick. You won't spread it to other people. And that should have been more directly challenged as well. And it's very unfortunate because, to this day, we now have people in this country who are, say I don't want to do anything until they're ordered by the government now as to whether they should stop wearing masks or not. I didn't wear a mask outside in the parking lot outside my school, and I got dirty stares, and an email went out the next day to everyone that we have to wear our masks outside the school when we drop off our kids, because the CDC still requires it. And it's so. Even though I'm vaccinated now too, so it doesn't matter. This is not the American spirit. This is not the American ideal.
Amish, I know Adam brought the answer into a lot of comments on particular public health policies. Is there anything you want to say about any of that, or either agreeing or dissenting?
Well, yeah, I would say that the reason that, just to recap the pandemic, the reason that these governors got put into this position of having to use or using or thinking that was the only tool they had was because we failed to test, trace, and isolate. And it is absolutely true that on the very first day of when we knew this was a pandemic, that the biopharmaceutical companies should have been engaged the way they were in South Korea to develop tests. But instead, we took this other approach by failing to use a WHO test, failing to use a South Korean test, but making a homegrown CDC test that failed, flawed, unable to use, had very strict testing criteria. And we got in a situation where we had no idea who was infected and who wasn't. And that's what those governors were left with. And they took this kind of authoritarian approach. I do think just one important thing to remember that I would say is that one of the things I would, from a public health standpoint, is you don't have the right to infect other people. So we did need to have some way to understand who was infected, who was not infected, and make sure that they weren't infecting other people or going about their business, because this is a disease that's not trivial for some proportion of the population. So there is an important role for public health law, but it has to be based on science, and it has to be kind of the lightest touch possible. And I think that's what kind of got thrown out. And most of the plans for pandemic planning were based on voluntary social distancing recommendations, not kind of a police approach or a government police power approach. And I think that basically got thrown out when people panicked and we had massive failures. And if you look at countries like Taiwan, which I keep bringing up, they did not have to resort to any of this because they tested, traced, and isolate from the very beginning, because they had a proper public health footing where they knew what the proper actions were and they executed them. And they had a vice president with a PhD in epidemiology, and we didn't. So that's another point too. But I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done on public health law and getting it right. And hopefully the pandemic will catalyze that, because I think there is too much incentives for short-term solutions and not long-range thinking, and too much attention to one problem without looking at all the cascading ripple effects that occurred when you actually address that problem solely to the exclusion of all others. So there's a lot more to say, and this is a whole other webinar to talk about all of that.
And we at the center here, that is the Salem Center for Policy at the University of Texas, Austin, are planning some more events on healthcare policy and on some related issues for the fall. We look forward to seeing you at those. Some of those will be in person if the state of both the pandemic and the law permits. And but I expect both will. I look forward to seeing some of you there. And I want to thank both of my co-panelists, again, Amish Adalcha of the Johns Hopkins Center for Biosecurity, Adam Mossoff of the Scalia Law School at George Mason. And this was a panel on why waivers for pandemic, for the COVID-19 drugs, for the patents on them is wrong. We hope to have convinced you, or to have given you at least something to think about.